Hey, book lovers. Welcome to While I Read. When I filmed the episode about Westerns with my dad, we had a great discussion about one of our favorite books, Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, as well as about the miniseries based on the book. When I was editing the episode together, I realized that it would be super long if I included the entire discussion of Lonesome Dove. But I didn't want to cut the discussion. I've decided that Lonesome Dove is special enough that it deserves a whole episode of its own. So that's what you get today, a discussion of Lonesome Dove, the book and the miniseries. Enjoy. One book that we didn't talk about last time is Lonesome Dove. And I definitely want to talk about that book because I know it's one of your favorites. So let's talk a little bit about Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry.
Okay, Lonesome Dove, yeah, it is one of my favorites. You can look at my copy and tell that it's one of my favorites. It's worn out. I need a new copy, I suppose, but I like to get it down every now and then and just read a section from it. Uh, Maybe every 2 or 3 weeks, I'll pull it off the shelf and read it. So, yeah, it is an award-winning book, by the way. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1985, I think. So,
Yeah, it is an award winning book. Back about 20 years ago, when I was in college, I took a prize winning novel class, and we studied books that had won American Book Awards or Pulitzer Prizes, and that was the book that I chose to write my term paper on in that class. I can't find that term paper. I looked for it when I knew we were going to talk about it in this episode and couldn't find it. But I remember really studying that book. I think I used that same copy that you have there, and I remember it was pretty beat up 20 years ago when I was using it. And I remember just really enjoying that book. Although it is, I mean, it's a tough book to read. It's not like a light, quick Louis L'Amour book. It's got a lot of violence in it, a lot of death in it. I guess it's more realistic.
it's got a lot more character development in it than the Louis L'Amour book, so, as you would expect, I suppose, from a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. And those characters are interesting. There's at least a half dozen very interesting characters in it. The two main characters were based on a couple of retired Texas Rangers that had actually stayed home in Texas at the request of the Texas governor during the Civil War to try to keep the Comanches from taking over South Texas while all the fighting age men in Texas had gone off to the war. And they had retired at the end of the war and gone into ranching business. And their names in the book are Augustus McCrae and Woodrow Call, I think is their name. And those two characters go all the way through the book, just about it. And then there's another character who was their compañero, as he called himself, named Jake Spoon. And Jake Spoon came to a bad end, if you read the book. There are a couple of very, very interesting female characters in the book.
Lori Darling.
Lori Darling. That's one of Augustus's phrases that he used in the movie. Lori Darling. And then there's his old flame that wouldn't marry him and went off and married somebody else named Clara Allen that he's always pining after. And then there's another female in the book who ran off and left her sheriff husband in Arkansas. So there are at least 3 or 4 different storylines that you have to follow all at the same time in that book with those characters.
The storyline of Clara, I remember using that in my paper that I wrote because one of the lines that she's taking care of her husband. Her husband has been injured and is in a coma.
Kicked in the head by a horse.
Yeah, and he's in a coma, and they've got 2 young daughters, and she's looking after him. She's played by Anjelica Huston in the movie, and I can see her in my mind playing it. But one of the lines that she says, her daughters come in and say, "It stinks in here, Mama." And it's in the husband's sick room. And the mother says, "Sometimes life doesn't smell good."
Yeah.
And that was a line that I used in my analysis of the book. So it's just got some great characters, some great discussion of life throughout the book.
Another good quote from that book is when Gus McRae, is scolding Captain Woodrow Call, because he had an affair with a prostitute, and then wouldn't follow up, and she had fallen in love with him, and that prostitute died, and Gus told Call, said she might not have died if you had followed up on this, and Call said, all Gus said, she would have died anyway. And Gus said, Call, it ain't dying I'm talking about, it's living.
Yeah, that's a great line.
Uh-huh.
One of my favorite parts of the movie that I love is when Gus and Call go into the saloon and the bartender doesn't show the respect to them that he should. Tell about that part, because I love that part.
Yeah, they go into a saloon, I think in Fort Worth, I'm not sure. And they walk up to the bar and they ask for a drink, and the bartender sort of ignores them to begin with. And then when he finally pours them a drink, he says, you cowboys ought to dust the sand off before you come in here. It's sandy enough without y'all dragging it in here. At which point Gus takes his little drink and turns it up and sets it down, and then throws the glass up in the air and shoots it with his pistol. And the bartender looks at him and says, why, you old son of a, and Gus whacks him upside the head and knocks him unconscious with a pistol that's about 10 inches long. And Carl looked at Gus and said, Gus said, you just upset because he didn't remember who you were. And Carl makes a statement, said Gus enjoyed being a famous Texas Ranger. And in fact, in the bar that they were in, there was a picture back there stood up by the mirror that had Carl and Gus and Jake Spoon in it when they had chased the Comanches back out of Fort Worth again.
Is that the scene where after Gus has gotten the bartender's head and slammed it into the table, and he says, I hate rudeness in a man. Yeah. Can't abide it.
No, that wasn't the same. That wasn't the same scene.
Okay.
That scene was when the old scout, the Army scout, started quirting Newt, the young boy, with his quirt. And
which is part of a whip.
Yeah, it's a whip. He'd taken a whip from one of the soldiers, and Carl jumped on his horse and he ran and he beat the guy almost to death. And he climbed up on his horse and everybody was looking and gawking, and Carl looked and said, I hate rudeness in a man. I won't abide it. And turned around and rode away.
Yeah. I love that. There are so many great lines in that movie. And I don't know if we mentioned Gus and Call. Gus is played by Robert Duvall. Call is played by Tommy Lee Jones.
Right.
Those are two great actors. I don't know if we can say that's their best role because they've had so many other good roles that they played, but it's a great movie.
I was doing a little bit of research on the screenplay on the movie, and actually it was written very early on as a screenplay, and they wanted John Wayne to play Call, but he wouldn't take that. He didn't like that character, so he wouldn't take it, and so the thing just sort of, disappeared. And then McMurtry, I think, if I'm not mistaken, got hold of the screenplay and wrote the novel based on that screenplay. Interestingly, here comes the historian in me. Interestingly, the two characters of Gus and Call, even though McMurtry said they weren't, they're based on Charlie Goodnight and Oliver Loving. And if you've ever watched many westerns or read many western novels, you've heard of the Goodnight Loving Trail, which was a cattle trail when they first started running cattle out of South Texas up across the plains up to the railhead in Kansas. They established that Goodnight Loving Trail. There's also a sad scene in the movie where their black scout, played by Danny Glover, his name was Dietz. Joshua Dietz is killed. And they bury Dietz, and Call takes a board that he finds, and he writes an epitaph for Deeds on that board and puts it up, you know, so anybody's coming back and see it, and it tells about what a brave man Deeds was and about how many Indian fighting engagements that they'd been involved in. Well, that actually happened. I believe the guy's name, I can't think of the black guy's name now, but was killed, and Oliver Loving actually did that Cole did in the movie, wrote the epitaph out for him. Another thing is that toward the end of the novel, Gus is killed by Indians, and actually he has both of his legs get poison in them, and he's going to have him amputated, and he won't agree to do that, so he dies, and he makes Call promise to take him back to Texas. This was up north. I don't know if they were in Montana yet, but he makes Call promise to take him back to Texas and bury him in a certain place where he and Clara Allen had enjoyed. They call it their orchard, and that actually happened when Oliver Loving died up there at their ranch up north. Goodnight actually took him back to Texas and buried him in Texas. So yeah, there's a lot of history involved in that.
And bringing in the literature, there are parallels with that journey to Faulkner's As I Lay Dying.
As I Lay Dying, and if you've ever read that, now we're going to do one sometime on Southern Gothic, and if you've ever read As I Lay Dying, it's so macabre, is that the way you pronounce that word, that it's funny. You know,
which is true of most Southern Gothic.
A lot of Southern Gothic. The grandmother dies, and she wants to go back to South Carolina, I think, to be buried, and they take her back, and the buzzards circle the wagon, and this and that, and the same thing happens in Lonesome Dove as Carl is taking Gus's body back. So yeah, there's a lot of history in it, and it's based on some factual stuff. It probably took place sometime in the late 1870s, and when they first started herding cattle and taking them up to the railhead in Kansas, and then they were actually going further than that. They were going up north to start a ranch up in the frozen North Country, up close to the Canadian border.
It's a great book. If you can't tell from what we're saying, you definitely need to read the book. And you need to watch the miniseries if you like Westerns.
The miniseries won some awards too.
Won a Golden Globe Award.
Yeah, it won, actually, I think it won 7 different Golden Globe Awards. You'll have to fact check me on that, but I think it was 7 awards that it won.
If Wilford Brimley says it won 7 awards, then it won 7 awards. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of Lonesome Dove as much as we enjoyed talking about it. Now, go ride your horse while I read.